So last week, um, we were giving you some thoughts on the comparison that you find in the early parts of Genesis. And I use this particular outline here, 7 considerations of a different way of reading Genesis. And we talked a little bit about how a later history in the nation of Israel under the reign of David has a lot of similarities in the book of Genesis. And we went through the first 6 of those. Adam's story is a preview of Israel's national story. The land promised to Abraham matches the borders during Solomon's reign. Abraham and Sarah's descendants are told that they will be kings. Number 4, Judah, the son of Jacob, is destined for kingship, and David is from the tribe of Judah. Genesis draws a political map of Israel's neighbors. Number 6, God's preference of the younger over the elder brother. And then we didn't have time, and I'm not going to take a lot of time tonight, but there's number 7 is quite interesting. So in Genesis chapter 38, there's a story about Judah and his daughter-in-law by the name of Tamar. And it's a pretty dicey story, but it has a lot of parallels to David. And so I want to use this chart for just a second. And you probably know the David story well enough. So I'm not going to turn to those passages, but I do want to turn to Genesis chapter 38 for a moment. In Genesis chapter 38, there's this story that is dropped into the Joseph narrative, which is quite ironic. So Joseph has a pretty lengthy section at the end of the book of Genesis, and this story about Judah and Tamar is kind of dropped right into the middle of that narrative. And the key question, I guess, is why? And it's a pretty dicey story. What we find is Judah, one of the brothers, it goes down to stay with a man of Adullam. Verse 1 says his name is Hira. And there Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. And she gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kazib that she gave birth to him. So we're told a little bit about his family, his wife, and his children. And then we're told that Judah got a wife for his oldest son, and her name is Tamar in verse 6. And then what we're told is verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. We're not given any other explanation of what he did wrong, but the writer of Genesis attributes his death to divine punishment. So now you have a widow by the name of Tamar, and the normal protocol would be that the next son would provide an ongoing heir for the family. And so that would fall to this guy named Onan in verse 8. And so he sleeps with her, but every time that he does, he refuses to impregnate her. And it tells us here that verse 9, but Onan knew that his offspring would not be his. So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. And so then we're told another divine punishment, verse 10, he did what was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. So now Judah has lost his first 2 sons, and he only has one left, and his name is Shelah. He's a younger individual, and so Judah says to Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So what Judah does is he does not follow the protocol of giving the third boy to Tamar to produce offspring. And so she goes off and she lives with her father, but she comes up with this ruse to trap Judah and to secure offspring. So in verse 13, it says, when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on the way to Timnah to shear sheep, she took off her widow's clothes and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself and sat down at the entrance to Enaim. And so she dresses up like a prostitute and she hangs out. And sure enough, Judah comes along and propositions her and lays with her. And while this episode is going on, what we find is she asks him a question down in verse 16. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. And he says, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. So in other words, I'll pay you later. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? And so he says, okay, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord. So he gives his personal belongings to disguise Tamar. And so the story goes on. And sure enough, she gets pregnant and she goes back and lives back at her father's house again. And he follows through on his pledge. Verse 20, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her because she's back at her father's house. So the story goes on, and after it's found out that she is pregnant, 3 months later, verse 24 says, about 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she's now pregnant. And Judah said, bring her out and we'll have her burned to death. So divine punishment, or at least human punishment, is coming her way until she produces this seal and this cord. And then what we find is that Judah becomes repentant. In verse 26, it says, Judah recognized the cord and the staff, and he says, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. And then she gives birth to twins. But this story has a lot of parallels to the David story. So look at this chart with me for a moment. So Judah commits a sin against Tamar by not providing his third son so she can have an heir. And David also commits a major sin. And knowing the story of David, they're both kind of embarrassed into admitting their guilt. You remember in 2 Samuel, that Nathan the prophet comes along and talks about an individual that's very wealthy taking a sheep from someone that's very poor, and then Nathan turns it on David and says, you are the man that took Bathsheba from Uriah. So there's parallel going on here. They're both guilty and they're kind of shamed into admitting it. Secondly, Judah's friend is Hira, there in verse 1 of chapter 38. But David has an ally, Hiram, in 2 Samuel 5:11. And it's interesting that the names are the same, except the last consonant is the only difference. Now, it continues to get interesting. So Judah's wife is the daughter of Shua. We're never told her name, but David's wife, we know her as Bathsheba, but 1 Chronicles 3:5 names her Bat-Sua. In other words, it's the son or daughter of Sua, and that's very close as well to the Shua of Genesis. Now it gets interesting. So number 4, the firstborn child, dies in Genesis 38:7, and the firstborn child of David and Bathsheba dies as well. Then Onan mistreats his sister-in-law by not fulfilling his responsibility. And then Amnon, the son of David, rapes his half-sister Tamar in 2 Samuel 13:4, and they both die from the hand of God, which is interesting. There's a divine punishment that's going on. Number 6, Shelah is being protected by his father from the fate of his brothers. He remembers what went on with Joseph. In 1 Kings 1:17-30, it's interesting that David pledges to Bathsheba that Solomon would be the successor, even though he's not the rightful one in line. He makes a promise that he will protect Solomon from the other boys. So you have others that are going to claim the right to the throne. But I want you to notice in the third column, there's a similarity between the names. So SLH in Hebrew and SLMH for the second name there is interesting. Shelah and Solomon have basically the same similarities, or they kind of come from the same root. Then Tamar is mistreated by Judah in Genesis 38. And in 2 Samuel 13:7, it's interesting that Tamar is mistreated by David. Now, Tamar, I am going to turn over there just for a second, because that will help us to understand this last comparison. So in 2 Samuel 13, what we're told is his son Amnon is in love with Tamar, his sister, half-sister really. And in verse 2 it says, Amnon became frustrated to the point of illness on account of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. And then it says, now Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, and Jonadab says, hey, why don't you pretend that you're sick and then ask Tamar to come and take care of you? Well, if you come on down, David is in on this. And in verse 7 of 2 Samuel 13, it says, David sent word to Tamar at the palace, go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him. So David probably knew something was going on and yet sent Tamar anyways. So Tamar goes to the house of Amnon, and she ends up being raped. And this will cause all kinds of other family problems, because his other son, Absalom, will kill Amnon because he raped his sister or half-sister. So here's my point in all this. When you look at these, it seems as though, since Genesis is probably written much later than we often assume, that some of these parallels that we find between these two stories are intentional. And one of the things that is probably happening is that to continue to say David is the rightful family line for the kingship, this story of Judah and Tamar, with all its similarities, is dropped into Genesis. Because Judah, in the blessing that is given to the 12 brothers at the end of the book of Genesis, it's Judah that's promised to be of the royal line, that will be of the kingly procession. And so what possibly is going on here is this story is dropped into Genesis as a way of saying, yes, David had his problems. Yes, David committed adultery. Yes, David wasn't right by the way he treated his other sons. Solomon was favored. There was also his mistreatment of Tamar, and she ends up getting raped, and that causes all kinds of other family problems. So in all of this, this last point is very complex, but it's most scholars see that it is really tightly compared one story to the other. So you can take that for what it's worth, but I think this last point kind of finishes off the topic from last week, and that is there's some David, although he's much later, that's found in the book of Genesis. And that gives credence kind of to a much later date of the book of Genesis than sometimes we naturally assume. So that's a complex thing. Let me see if I can answer any questions, and then we're going to switch topics for tonight. Anything that you'd like to comment on? So you can see that's what scholars do with the text. We read it, they study it, and there's a huge difference because they notice a lot of the things that we just kind of, skip over or don't even notice sometimes. Anything? Okay. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about the flood story. So I'm going to assume that you know the basics of the flood story, because you can see there's a lot of text in Genesis that's given to this story in chapters 6 through 9. Now, the first thing that we need to come to when we talk about Noah, the flood, and the death of all living human beings except Noah and his family, as told in the Genesis narrative, is the first thing we need to really fess up on is this is an ugly story, because we tell it in Sunday school, the ark, and they bring animals in 2 by 2 and all that type of thing. But on an adult level, we're talking about genocide here of the entire human race. So it's a very delicate and a very complex set of questions that come up when we're talking about this particular story. So the first thing we notice is it's horrific. On all levels, it's horrific. And why has things gotten so bad that God says, hey, I'm going to start all over again. I'm just going to wipe everybody out? Well, couldn't have God thought of another route? Or if God is all-knowing, why did he create in the first place if he's going to destroy all human beings in the process? So there's a lot of morality that's attached to this story as well. So you see some of the questions that come up here on the screen. Why would a loving God and master designer of the universe do such a thing? And then, does this mean that God is still a loving God if he agrees to take this route? Or is there something else that's going on in the text? And I want you to hold on to that for a second. Next, is the flood story unique to the nation of Israel? Did other nations write about this? Are there notations? Hold on to that as well. So I'm asking you to hold on to 2 things at the same time for a moment. If everyone dies, then how would the other nations, if there are other accounts, know about it? And how did they write about it? So it's a confounding story. There's other things that come into the story as well. Is this a worldwide flood? Is it a localized natural disaster? And if all the animals, at least 2 of them, come into the ark, what about the animals that come from areas of the world that, would have no possible way of getting to where this ark is found? So I just put this as an example. How'd the kangaroo get from Australia to the Middle East? Okay, so there's all kinds of questions that come about here. And then finally, did the flood cause the extinction of some living creatures like the dinosaurs? So we have, you know, fossil records that dinosaurs existed.
I'm just looking at it.
And so what happened to them, and, you know, and what caused that? So do you see there's multitude of questions when you enter into this particular story. So I'm sure you could probably think of a lot more of them as well. But let's just hold on to these for a moment and let's kind of move forward. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do if we're going to understand this story is we've got to step out of modernity and back into the ancient world. So how would the Israelites have understood this story? How did other ancient Near Eastern empires or nations understand this? So what seems to be a commonality is that not only the Noah story in the book of the Genesis, but the other flood stories that are found in other ancient Near Eastern literature have something in common. And what they have in common is that this was some type of punishment from the gods. So whether it was localized or more than that, at least the ancients understood that this is something that must have been a punishment from the gods because we did something wrong. So we got to step back out of modernity again and understand that the ancients didn't understand the land they lived on as a globe. They just didn't. To them, the world was flat. And so to think of it as a global flood on the sphere that we live on wouldn't even be a part of their vocabulary because they understood the world to be flat. You remember a couple Bible studies ago, I showed you kind of that ancient cosmology picture that was the way they kind of viewed the universe. Another thing that was common is seasonal flooding was just a part of their experience. However, an extensive flood that might last for a number of weeks was out of the ordinary. And if it was out of the ordinary, then it probably caused a lot more devastation than just a temporary flooding that was a part of the seasonal cycle. So that's why they probably began to associate it with divine punishment. So we have to kind of put ourselves in their world, not bring them into our world. And the main thing that I think is important in understanding this particular narrative is, why are the gods angered? Why are they sending all this water? And why is it destroying things that we need to live? So with that, I think that's kind of a part of the mindset that we have to assume when we step into the Genesis 6 or 9 story. Some thoughts there? So I mentioned, did other nations know of this flood or floods, plural? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, the story that's in Genesis is not the oldest one. So look here on the screen, you see that many of the neighbors of the Israelites also have flood stories. And there's a lot of similarities between some of theirs and the Genesis account. Some of the stories even predate the Genesis account by a good number of years. And one of them is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll talk about that in a second. But these older versions come from Samaria and Assyria and Babylon. But you'll notice on the screen here, it's interesting that there are flood stories in Aztec culture, Greek culture, Hindu, Buddhist, Norse, Aborigines, Chinese, Muslim, and Native Americans as well. So in all their writings, there's these stories of floods. Now, some of them might have been passed along, but maybe some of them are their own unique ways of trying to understand what happens when things like tornadoes and hurricanes and flooding and tsunamis and stuff like that happen. And so most archaeologists think that there was some type of a major flood that happened somewhere around 3000 BCE or 2900 BCE. And they think that this kind of set within their mindset, and they began to ask the question, why? Why did we experience this? And of course, that same question is asked by us all the time when something unusual and unnatural happens. So right now, the story is still on Surfside, Florida, with this apartment building that's collapsed. And the key question is, why? Okay, why did that happen? And why did so many people lose their lives? So it's an ongoing question that we ask and try to answer as human beings. So it seems as though archaeologists understand that there was something unusual that happened somewhere around 3000, 2900 BCE. And what's interesting is most of the flood stories that are generated out of that time period, all associated with human beings doing something wrong, and the gods are enacting their judgment upon human beings. So what's interesting is these flood stories seem to have significant roots in science, and geomythology is the study of how ancient stories and geology intersect together. So these flood stories may have tried to explain some geological phenomenon of natural disasters. And we have the account that's found in Genesis. But Genesis will add something that the others do not. So we'll come to that, but I don't want to leave you in the dust if you have some questions. Any questions or comments so far? So one of the ancient flood stories is the Atrahasis epic. And what's unique about this story, it goes back to the 17th century. That's the surviving discoveries of archaeologists, but it's older than that. And part of the story recounts a flood, and also the reason that the gods made human beings. Now, in this ancient mythology, human beings are considered to be slave labor. And one of the things that the gods want to do is get their rest. So you notice point number 2, human beings were becoming too noisy and the gods weren't able to get their good night's sleep. And so the god Enlil decreed that human beings should be destroyed by a flood. Atrahasis, through the help of the god Ea, escapes the wrath of Enlil by building a large boat in which to save humanity. So here's where the similarity to the Noah story comes in. Scholars will argue that the noise suggests rebellion against the gods for their forced labors, and humans failed to respect the distance that God had put between them, and they were not being what they were created to be, and that is submissive slaves that is not going to cause any type of revolt or, in this case, noise. So the boat is a similar commonality with the Genesis story here. that I just mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one that comes out of Samaria, and Gilgamesh is a historical figure living sometime between 2800 and 2500 BCE. But it's a story that has evolved because it takes the older story, it seems, from Atrahasis, and what it does is it adds some elements to it that is closer to the Genesis account. So this Epic of Gilgamesh is a lengthy story. There's actually 12 tablets, but the flood element is not added until the 11th tablet that was found. And what we're told is that Gilgamesh has this friend that dies, and he goes on a journey to find the secret of immortality. And that brings the hero of the story, a guy by the name of Utnapishtim. And what we find is that Gilgamesh believes he has the answer to immortality. He finds, though, that he doesn't, and amid his conversation, Utnapishtim tells him the flood story. And that's what then he takes back, and it becomes a part of this epic story of Gilgamesh that is added on later. So what does all this mean? So I want you to notice between these two ancient flood stories how similar it is to the Genesis account. So first, a flood and a building of a huge boat. There's pitch that seals the boat. The boat is built to precise dimensions. The biblical boat is much larger than the ones that are found in these other two accounts. Both clean and unclean animals come aboard. A Noah-like figure and his family are saved. The boat comes to rest on the top of a mountain. In the biblical account, a raven and doves are sent out, but in Gilgamesh, it's a swallow that's sent out. Animals fear humans. The deities smell the pleasing aroma of the sacrifice after the rains have stopped. And then there is some type of an oath that is given that a judgment won't reoccur like this. In the case of the Genesis account, it's the rainbow. But in the case of the Gilgamesh account, it's a lapis lazuli necklace that is to be kind of the sign of the covenant. But there's just kind of similarities that kind of are intertwined in all three of these accounts, between the biblical account, Gilgamesh, and Atrahasis as well. And so the question becomes, is the biblical account taking the older stories and then changing the narrative a little bit to serve a purpose? And in the narrative of Genesis 6 through 9, what we find is an interesting theology develops. So the theology of the flood story in the Bible is kind of distinct from these other ancient flood stories. So what is the point that the Israelites are trying to make about God versus the gods who are just out to destroy humanity because they're making too much noise? Well, it seems as though there are two primary reasons why this judgment comes. So now I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 6. And this is an unusual paragraph that's here, but there are two reasons that are given in verses 1 through 6 of why this flood came about. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. It says, when men began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every indication of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. And the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then we're given the Noah account. The Toledot account of Noah begins in verse 9. So what's interesting here is these two reasons. You'll notice them on the screen. There's this curious paragraph of the sons of God cohabitating with the daughters of men. And then secondly, the universal wickedness that is mentioned here in verse 5. So it seems as though the biblical account is trying to suggest that the reason for the flood is there's some type of crossing of boundaries between what is proposed to be kind of divine and humans, and then the violence and wickedness that we're told about in verse 5. And it's mentioned a couple other times in the account as well, that violence was on the face of the earth. So this story is added to, even though it's very similar to the other two epic stories that we just talked about. What it doesn't suggest is that the flood was some type of out of control rainstorm where it just had rained hard for too long. What it does suggest is that there's some type of divine reason for this. And in what we find is it seems as though the creation is falling back to the pre-Genesis chapter 1 condition where there is chaos that's reigning, and God is going to start over because the order of creation that we're told about in Genesis chapter 1 seems to be deteriorating into disorder. So let me stop there and see if you have some thoughts or questions. So you can see, is this a pretty technical story? It's not a simple Sunday school story at all. But there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of reasoning, and then of course our own ability to kind of cross the bridge back into the ancient mindset rather than using our modern mindset. Thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah, Etsy just said, if you couldn't hear, that God wanted to destroy men and animals, which is interesting. So, you know, that's again going back to the Genesis chapter 1 on the sixth day of creation, where animals and mankind are created. That and element, and birds of the air as well. Yeah. So the key question is, why God? That seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? Wasn't there any other way to get a handle on the disorder and problems on the face of the earth? So what we want to do for a second here is come back to this paragraph and kind of talk about the first few verses in chapter 6, because that's an intriguing paragraph. What is it talking about? The sons of God and the daughters of men. But I don't want to go there until you're ready to, if you have questions at this point. Now, in order to get a handle on this one story, I think you have to hold simultaneously 3 stories in your hand at the same time. Creation, we're just referring to that a moment ago. Secondly, Noah, and then thirdly, the Exodus. Each of these stories have water in them. And I think what's interesting about this is um, even in the creation story, this idea of the firmament is in place. And then, how does it go? I can't remember how. Um, oh, yeah, verse 6 of chapter 1 of Genesis. Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. So water is playing an important role in creation, in the Noah story, as well as in Exodus, because that's going to be the means of escape as they cross the Red Sea. God is holding back the water for them as they cross into the promised land. So, number one point, I think, of these three stories is God is the one that's in control of the water. When water's held back, there's life. When water is released, there's judgment or there's destruction. But if these three stories mean anything to a later group of people who had been in exile for a number of years, if God is in control of the water, God is also in full control of his people as well. And it seems as though in each case, God ultimately and finally tames the chaotic waters that are bringing trouble and destruction. And this God is still the God of the Israelites. And I think that is what the distinct element is in the Noah story versus those other older stories that we were just talking about. It's making a comment about the nature of this God who chose them as a nation and who allowed them to go into exile. And it gives to them hope that they believe God will tame the waters, figuratively speaking, again, and they'll be able to go back home. So, you have some thoughts there at all? Okay, so let's come back to Genesis 6. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the big question that surfaces in this paragraph is, who are these sons of God? And there's been a variety of answers that have been given to that. There have been those that argued these are some type of tyrannical rulers that have the power to go and take women and bring them into their harems and do with them as they want. In fact, this is the most popular Jewish interpretation. So if you were to read a Jewish study Bible, this would be the predominant view. However, St. Augustine comes along a little bit later in church history and says that the sons of God represent the godly line of Seth, and the daughters of men represent the ungodly line of Cain. And that was held as part of the interpretive history for a while. But I guess most recently, over the last few hundred years, there's been this growing knowledge of ancient Near Eastern mythology that they believed that there were times when the divine came into the realm of the humans. So you remember the two visitors that visited Abraham, and it's believed that they were angels or some type of divine representation. And Abraham is concerned about his nephew Lot and intercedes when he is told that there's destruction that is coming to Sodom and Gomorrah. So this particular viewpoint says that there's some type of boundary between the divine and the human realm that was violated. So theologians have said that these are fallen angels, and that one reason for the flood was this contamination of the human race with the divine nature cohabitating with human nature, and that's one of the reasons that God had to destroy humans to get creation back on course, because humans were created in the image of God and carry out the role of being God's caretakers on earth, but they never ever are given a divine nature. So again, this particular paragraph is one that I guess sets up the Noah story. You see what I'm saying? It kind of sets it up. It's at the beginning, and between the violence and this unusual paragraph here, it launches into the Noah story and kind of takes it further than the other flood stories that we have found, and adds this divine element that God wants to put creation back on track. God is God, humans are humans. God loves human beings. He entrusts this new start to Noah. And Noah, in many respects, is the new Adam. He's the one that's starting the human race over again. And that's why we're told in chapter 6, verse 9, that he is blameless and righteous. That's Adam before the fall. So he's going to start all over again. And humanity is to be the apex of God's creation, not slave labor, as in the other ancient stories. So the unique perspective from the Bible is that human beings have dignity, they have worth, they have a purpose, they have a commission from God to take care of the earth, to populate and to fill the earth, all of these type of things. And what we find is that the Israelites are kind of tapping in to an ugly set of circumstances and to an ugly story, a genocidal story, to talk about this God that made human beings unique and gave human beings this ability to reflect his nature in the way they treat each other and the way they treat the planet. So, thoughts there?
Yeah, I have a question back on the last slide, Larry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it was the last. Yeah. When you're talking about angels, you were thinking cohabitating
Mm-hmm.
with humans.
Mm-hmm.
But we've always been taught that angels are basically asexual.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. So how can that be?
Yeah. Well, I guess the reasoning that would go behind this is that while angels might be asexual, they can assume human bodies. So remember in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the angels that come to town, the population in Sodom want to use sexual violence upon these visitors. Now, there's a lot to that story, but so I guess the answer would be, or at least possible answer, would be that angels who are spirit can, become incarnate, I guess, in certain situations. We find that when angels do appear later in the biblical narrative, you have Gabriel, you have Michael.
Right.
They appear as men, even though, like you said, angels probably do not have, the male-female distinction. But yeah, that's a great question. It's a really good question. So that's why then some other interpreters have said, no, this is probably meaning something else. They're these sons of God, which can often be a royal title for kingship and royalty and that type of thing. They're using and abusing other elements of the population. But what's fascinating about this, though, is the term that is given in verse 4 here is the Nephilim. And the Nephilim were considered to be heroes of old, men of renown, we're told in verse 4. So whatever it is, it seems as though these individuals, whoever these individuals are, their offspring have a lot more potential and power. They're bigger, they're stronger than the common population of the day.
Yeah.
You know, that type of thing. So, of course, isn't that what was told to the in the report from the 12 spies that goes to spy out the land? They're bigger
Right.
than us, they're stronger than us, that type of thing. And of course,
They're the
Philistines,
giant.
yeah, and the Philistines too, and Goliath being one of them,
Mhm.
is much bigger than
Right.
the common. So, you know, I think these different viewpoints all have both strengths and weaknesses to them. I really do. The one thing I think that no matter what position you favor is that it seems to be the setup for the Genesis story of the flood, because it's right there at the beginning.
Mhm.
So how that plays in, we might not know completely, but so you're right. That's a great point. You know, does the theology nix that third viewpoint?
Yeah.
You know, so I guess the only thing that I would think of, you don't need to turn here, but in the book of Jude, in the New Testament, there is a strange reference. I will see if I can find it real quick. And people have often associated this to that story back in Genesis. Let me see if I can find it here real quick. Jude, where are you? So if I can find it, okay, right here in Jude verse 6, if you want to look at it at some point, it says here, verse 5 says, though you already know all this, I want to remind you that the Lord delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And then there's this curious verse, and the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their own home, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. And in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. So there are some theologians that try to connect this angels that abandoned their position to the Genesis chapter 6 stories there.
So that would be the third of the angels that were cast out with Satan then?
Well, the reasoning goes like this. Yeah, there's a segment of the created order of angels that fell in rebellion to God. But it says here, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains. Was there another element of it that God has already brought judgment on? You know, are all fallen angels already in captivity, or is just a certain segment of it, is kind of how the reasoning goes. And if they are, why does this subset of angels, why are they held in imprisoned? And we're assuming that other fallen angels or demons are free at this point, that final judgment has not come. So boy, it's tough to get a definitive answer on this.
Yeah.
You know, but I'm just telling you, that's one way that some of the biblical scholars try to to wrestle with it, and they associate Jude's commentary back to Genesis chapter 6. Whether that's right or wrong, then, that's one attempt to try to make an
Okay.
explanation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so my last slide for tonight is, okay, yeah, we have all this information. There's ancient flood stories. It seems as though the Genesis account is doing something different than the other ancient accounts. But did the flood really happen? That might be the question that some people will ask. So I mentioned earlier tonight that it was virtually certain that there were one or more local floods in Mesopotamia around 3000, 2900 BCE. That was the basis for a lot of these flood stories that made their way into the folklore of the people that existed at that time. You'll notice on this slide here, but the geological record, at least as interpreted by mainstream scientists, discounts any notion of a worldwide flood that killed every single creature on Earth, save a few, as told there in Genesis 6 and 7. So did the flood really happen? There was my feeling is there was something catastrophic that occurred locally, and they caused an abundance of these flood stories. I don't think it was a worldwide flood, and I don't think that they even had the mindset that the Earth was a globe. So if you can envision, we're living on a flat plane. The ancient mindset would be this water covered all of this and destroyed certain things. Second point there is the contextual and scientific reasons suggest that maybe this is not a statement of historicity as much as a theological statement of identity, and that the God of the Israelites is the God that is the water tamer and can continue to bring new life even out of devastation. So the last point I want to make, and then if you have some questions or comments, for ancient Israel, as for other ancient cultures, a cataclysmic and tragic flood had to be explained somehow. So Israel's explanation is probably no more historically accurate than the others, but it does tell us how they understood God and the place of human beings in God's world, because it just has such a higher viewpoint of human beings that God is willing to start all over again, as the story is telling us, because this project or purpose of God is that human beings reflect him on the earth. And that's something that God was willing to take a risk to do when he created mankind. And it's something that he continues to do to try to bring people back into their created purpose to be an image bearer of God. So, and that then obviously suggests that things like violence and the mistreatment of other people as accounted for here in so much of Genesis is out of place. And so that type of thing. Thoughts, comments, questions?
In the other stories where there's a flood from other religions and civilizations, do they also use it for the purpose of a starting over sort of,
I don't think so.
Approach?
I think it's from what I know of it, and I am not an expert on this. From what I know of it is that for them, it is more an explanation of the physical phenomenon of too much water and the damage that it has produced. And because it's cataclysmic, it must have some divine connection. The gods must be involved in this in some way. But I don't think that there's quite as profound connection to this idea of renewal and starting over as in the biblical account.
I mean, because back in that time, I mean, the only logical really approach for wiping out the world was a flood. I mean, they really, I guess they could have set up a pandemic or an epidemic, but that, you know, and there's a little bit of that, I think, in different places in the Bible, but you don't really, I'm not sure they ever experienced or thought much about that.
Yeah.
So if you wanted a physical way to destroy the world as they knew it, that was probably it. I mean, they didn't know about an asteroid hitting the planet or other possible, you know, cataclysmic events.
Mhm.
So it seemed, and also it doesn't seem complicated from a renewal standpoint to then think to then say flood wiped everybody out, but there was a boat that carried the survivors of the world to start new, you know, both people and animals. I do, you know, it just doesn't seem that complicated. It would be, because it's almost by default the logical approach you would use at that point if you were going to talk about God saying, I'm unhappy with what I've created and I need to start over. That's the obvious, maybe the only approach even simple people back then could have utilized.
I think so. I think you're exactly right. And maybe the boat motif as well is important to ancient people, because they kind of believed, let's say like in Egypt, that when a person died, they have to travel across the river by boat to the other world, the netherworld or whatever. And so this whole boat motif might have been a part of the DNA, I guess, of the ancient mind. And that might have some role in this as well.
You know, the Vikings use the same thing.
Yeah. Mhm.
You guys seen the modern movie of the Ark with, who was in it, Bud? Do you remember?
You mean
It's,
Noah?
The
Russell Crowe?
Noah.
The guy from The Office.
Yeah, Noah was in it. It's or it was with Hermione Granger was one of the son's wives, and I think it was the guy who was in the Gladiator movie you like,
Oh
Bud,
yeah.
was Noah.
Russell Crowe, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Noah?
Russell Crowe.
Yeah, it's the more violent
It's
Noah and the
Yeah.
Ark story.
I just watched
Yeah.
it several weeks back. It's on one of the platforms. I can't remember which one. Actually, it's very good because it portrays not only the violence, but it portrays the struggle internally that he had with
Yeah.
all that was going on. And I thought they did a good job with that. And of course, the violence element of it was accurate, because that's kind of
Oh, yeah.
right out of the biblical text, that, you know, one of the reasons that God was bringing the flood was because of violence. So yeah, if you get a
Mhm.
chance to see it, I think, you know, it's good. It'll challenge your thoughts about how to think about this particular story. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
How deep were these floods?
That's a
Does
good
it
question.
say?
I don't know.
If
Well,
they're like locally, how can they have such deep water or something?
Well, they
Oh,
must
well,
have,
look how
'cause if
deep
they
it
built
got.
that big boat.
Katrina
Yeah.
got.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, Mark. All I have come across so far is this idea that there was something that happened, but I have not researched it enough to know what calculations are being
Yeah.
made, you know, on that. Other comments or questions? Okay, so you see, these stories have all kinds of depth to them. And it's easy then to begin to see where different
Yeah.
things come from in terms of our thoughts and interpretations because of it. So, okay, well, we'll stop here tonight then, and hope to see you this coming Sunday, okay?
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, I want to see
Right.
our funny looking girl. There.
There she is.
Poor thing.
Poor baby.
You gotta like shoot food into her, like throw it in the
I
cone.
had to put her bowl on the bottom of the cone so she could eat it.
Yeah,
Aw.
They say she'll figure it out, but she
Yeah.
has, yeah,
Well, that's the first day. So,
yeah.
yeah.
all right, folks. I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
All right, you
too.
too.
Night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.